take them down and take them down and take them down, take them down, take them down and take them down and take them down. As you look, the whole room explode down and as you look, the whole room explode down and.
So, the name of this talk is The Best Programming Language. This is a topic that comes up quite a bit, especially with younger developers who they know one or two languages and they tend to get very... What's that? So the young guys, they tend to only know a couple of languages and they get become very enthusiastic about that language. And there's good reasons for this. When you're just starting out coding, you tend to become enamored with the power of building software, and you fall in love with the tools that you use. And those tools maybe are limited, but often the guy doesn't see it. He sees the power, and so he starts to get into his head, this is the best programming language. And so you see a lot of these arguments, particularly amongst the younger guys, about what's the best programming language? Mine's better than yours. It's got OO this and library that and monkey patching and whatever. But the truth is, there really is no best programming language. So I'm going to go a little bit into my background. I've been coding professionally for 18 years. And I started off doing front-end UI stuff. I was doing it in Lotus Notes, using a language called Formula Language. I used quite a bit of a thing called Lotus Script, which is actually like a variant of BASIC. Quickly, I moved over to C and C++. I was doing back-end development there. I also did a bunch of Java work. And later, when I started on CouchDB, I started writing that code. So CouchDB is a NoSQL database that's document-oriented, has bidirectional replication, has a incremental MapReduce view engine that has a lot of interesting properties. But I had to write all this stuff from scratch. I was kind of imitating what I had seen in Lotus Notes, trying to reproduce that in a more modern style, bring that into the modern web world. And so I picked, at first I wrote it in C++ because that's what I knew. And then I tried to learn Erlang, and I gave up because Erlang seemed so weird. And I kept going on my C++ code base. Then I had to deal with concurrency and lots of users. And I didn't want to go with the traditional shared memory threading model with locks and mutexes and conditionals and things like that. I knew that was pretty difficult, and I kept hearing more and more about Erlang. So the second time I learned it, I was very motivated to learn it and get past the weirdness. And I fell in love with Erlang. It was amazingly productive. But now, in our code and in our work, we're actually migrating away from Erlang, and there's good reasons for that. So the truth is that there is no one best programming language. There are many different criteria for a programming language, some of which I'm going to talk about, that will actually make it the best for your situation. And often you won't necessarily choose the best, but you'll choose something that's pretty good. But there's your productivity, the performance of the language, the reliability and the predictability of it, the portability, is it going to run in all the places that you need it to run, the community. This is actually a hugely important reason to pick a language or not pick a language. And then there's just what you already know, which often is not a great reason to pick a programming language. So I'll talk a little bit about all those things. So productivity. This is really, really important, particularly if you're building something where you don't know if it's going to take. You don't know if you're going to be able to find an audience of users. Being able to rapidly prototype your code, get it working, get it reliable in a very quick pace, and then get it pushed out there so that users can start playing with it. Productivity can be absolutely huge. And with Erlang, I found I was extremely productive. With C++, it was taking me much longer. The early versions of CouchDB, I wrote them in C++, and I worked for about 6 months getting that initial code base written. I had a storage engine, a query engine. I had no concurrency, no actual way to connect to it over a network. Had no actual API for network clients. I moved over to Erlang, and a language that I didn't know. And when I started coding in that, I was able to duplicate everything I had written in C++ in about 6 months. And I was a very experienced C++ programmer at that time, probably written close to 100,000 lines of C++ code, coming to a language, Erlang, that I knew nothing about, and so didn't know it at all. And it was so much more productive for me that I was able to move almost 10 times faster. And I just kept coding at it and kept using it, and I was just astounded just how much better it was. And the code size was amazingly small. I had been used to working on code bases that were millions of lines of code. When we released CouchDB 1.0, the code base, the production code, not including the tests, was under 20,000 lines of code. And that included a from-scratch storage engine, a from-scratch reporting engine, bidirectional replication, an HTTP API, security built in, and interfacing with JavaScript with SpiderMonkey. So we had a lot of functionality packed into there in a very small amount of code. To get that into C++ probably would have taken at least 5 to 10 times the amount of code, lines of code, to get that same productivity. Now, when you're choosing a language and you're considering productivity, you have to not only consider something like Erlang, where it's very quick to get something banged out, but is it have the capabilities that you need? So I would never write a database server in Ruby, and I wouldn't write a web application in Erlang, because Erlang has terrible, terrible string handling. So when you're doing that sort of thing, the productivity really drops off. When you're in Ruby and you're doing a lot of string processing and things like that, it's got lots of nice coding constructs and little helpers and things that are going to help you be really productive. So with a language and productivity, it really depends on the task at hand. If you're doing front-end development, string handling and composability, the ability to add in a bunch of libraries and things like that is more important than being able to create a B tree from scratch. Like an Erlang made that pretty easy. So there's also performance considerations with your language. Now, again, if you're doing front-end development and you're just yourself or you have a small team, frequently you shouldn't be worrying too much about performance. If you're spending a bunch of time thinking about performance ahead of time, you are going to really impact your ability to iterate. And you as engineers are expensive, but machines are relatively cheap. So worrying about performance is often not a huge consideration for most people. Now, in the business that I am in, where we're actually building infrastructure software, database software, performance is hugely important to us. And we have a lot of engineers that are really great at low-level coding, and we have a lot of customers where they really want it to perform. They want to be able to handle their database load on the fewest machines possible, because we're creating shrink-wrap software. So the ability for us to iterate is not nearly as important as it is for us to have high performance and us to be able to take that engineering hit in time to make things really perform so that our customers don't pay that price. They don't care how long it takes for us to develop the code. They only care when they get it out there how much it costs to run. But a lot of people don't have that same consideration. And so if you can get away with just creating more machines or just optimizing the little bits of code or whatever that really become the bottleneck, or having a beefier back-end database server. That's typically how you should go about your performance considerations. So when I say performance, it's not just how fast is it, but do I need it to be that fast? You have to ask yourself. So obviously faster is always better, but there's a cost to that. And that also goes back to the productivity. Reliability. How predictable is this language? How often am I going to have to be debugging it? How debuggable is it? When we chose Erlang, we use Erlang, it's an extremely reliable and robust language. I've dealt a lot with Java systems where you have multi-threading and shared state memory, and it's very difficult to get that same level of reliability out of that programming model. And also when you have garbage collected languages, you're frequently battling the garbage collector, and if the heap grows so big that it's actually gone into swap, then your performance just drops out the window. When that garbage collector kicks in, it's now going to be visiting a bunch of memory that might not be in RAM but might be on disk, and that's going to have to pause, and all of a sudden you're wondering, why is my application server seem to be frozen? And so reliability isn't just does it crash, it's also does it have predictable performance when I need it? Because if all of a sudden it goes so slow as to be unusable, that's also unreliable. There's a lot of different aspects to reliability in database industry. Losing your data is like that's the cardinal sin. But again, there's also uptime, latency, predictability. If you're creating a front-end web application server and it runs fine for one day, but then the next day it starts going slow, next day after that it goes slower and slower and slower, that is not reliable. That's not fulfilling your SLA problems that you want to give a nice snappy experience to users. And Amazon and Google and a lot of other big retailers, they know that low latency, web pages that load fast is a big, big deal for usability. And it's a big, big deal for user satisfaction. So picking a language that allows you to move quickly and not degrade performance and is important. And there's actually one language that I feel people dump on it all the time, but it's actually quite good for a predictable experience, and that's PHP. Now I know a lot of people think, oh, PHP is horrible, it's ugly, but the model of it where it starts up, does a request, and then shuts down, and the operating system now recovers all those resources, means that it tends to be very, very predictable over time. When you have a Java application server, for instance, where you have threads that stay around and sessions and try to reuse things, there can be all sorts of things that degrade the performance over time. Memory leaks, resource leaks, the garbage collector just kicking in at weird times. PHP is actually quite nice. So there's lots of different aspects to reliability. And when you say reliability, very few people think PHP. But the truth is that when it's deployed in a certain way, it is actually quite reliable. Portability is also a big concern. It doesn't matter how great the language is if you can't actually deploy it where you want to. So if you're writing a bunch of code, like say in PHP, and now you want to port that application over to, say, Android or iOS, well, that was probably not a great choice. And if you're using C# and you have a Microsoft stack, that's great. But if you want to go over to a cheap hosting provider and you want to have an open source community, that portability, the fact that you tend to be married to the Microsoft stack, is going to bite you. And there is the Mono project, but it's just not the same as running on the Microsoft stack, not nearly as full-featured. It doesn't have the same community. So portability is a huge concern. And most scripting languages, most of the popular scripting languages are really portable. You can get Python and Ruby and Perl, and they run everywhere. So that's often a big concern. And usually you know well ahead of time where it is that you want to deploy your code. Community. Here there's no community. You're going, hey, I got this problem, and I'm I'm going to go and ask the community. And if you have a small community, that's a problem. So with Erlang, that has been a huge problem for us. There's just not a lot of Erlang coders out there. There's not a lot of libraries. There's not a lot of support. Not a lot of tutorials. It's even though we've been ridiculously productive in Erlang, we have really suffered because it does not have the big community. Part of the reason I think that is with Erlang is it's got a really weird syntax. And that scares a lot of people off. So I think Erlang is actually brilliant, the design of it, and the VM. I think that this is the future of the way that languages and language VMs should work. But the syntax is so weird that it sort of prevents mass adoption, and you need mass adoption to get this, the really nice, healthy community. And Erlang's community is just always kind of lagging behind. And then you also have to consider what kind of community. So if you for instance, are working on a C# stack, that's the Microsoft stack, and they're going to have a very different community and a very different culture than more of the open source languages like Ruby or even Java, because it tends to be in this Microsoft world where people tend to be very corporate developers, and it's just going to have a very, very different feel. And you're probably not going to have as many cool open source libraries that you can. You're probably not going to have as many cool open source libraries to choose from, and they're not. That becomes a big problem. And so the Erlang thing has just continuously bitten us, and this is the #1 reason why I'm wanting to abandon Erlang. So at Couchbase, we're rewriting more and more and more of our back-end software in C and getting it out of Erlang because I feel like it's never going to get there. I had high hopes early on when I started with Erlang that okay, this is the language of the future. Its time has come, and they have a small cadre of really excited developers who are really committed to the language, but it never seems to grow beyond that. And you see this in Python, you see this in Ruby, you see this now in JavaScript, where there's just lots of excitement, lots of people investing in it. They're creating tools around it, lots of libraries. If the community isn't there, you end up having to do a whole lot more work that in other places people have the knowledge, they have the libraries, the tutorials, the tooling to make your job much easier. And that really is a huge, huge deal. Can't emphasize that enough. So another reason to choose a programming language is that it's what you already know. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And this is actually one of the less good reasons for choosing a programming language. But if you're not sure what you're building and you feel really comfortable with the language, often, okay, just choose what you know, allow yourself to be productive, do some exploration, and you're good to go. But eventually you might realize, okay, this language is ill-suited for what it is that I'm actually trying to build. And when you realize that, you probably should, as soon as possible, jump ship and go with that better suited language. So with CouchDB, the initial versions I wrote in C++ because I really knew C++. I knew it very, very well. After a while, I started to realize, okay, this is getting to be too much work. I'm just one guy. I have to produce all this stuff. And I found Erlang, which was much better suited to the problem I was trying to solve. And I sort of wish that I hadn't wasted that 6 months writing it in C++, but I don't necessarily know that was a mistake, but I do know it would have been a mistake to stay on it for a long period of time. Moving to Erlang allowed me to iterate and explore and try out new ideas much more quickly. And with C and C++, I was just constantly buried in details that were really irrelevant to what I was trying to do. So there is value in going with what you already know, but then there's also value in learning something new and and making sure that that's something that is better suited to what you're doing. And another analogy I like to use is when I've worked on my own car, changed the oil or fixed something about it. Frequently, I don't know how to do it, and I don't have the right tool. But I get excited that, okay, this is something I can do. I just have to go out and buy the tool and then go back and fix my car or whatever. So an example is I had to change a control arm on an old Mustang, and I needed to buy a thing that would allow me to compress the spring. And it was a lot of work, and it probably would have been just as expensive to hire a mechanic to do it as it would have been for me to buy the tool and do it myself. But at the end of it, I now had this knowledge of how to do this, and I had this cool new tool that I haven't used since, but sometimes I actually get a chance to reuse the tool. And that's the advantage of going with a language that you don't necessarily know, which is now you maybe have spent some more time, you've put in some more effort, but at the end of it, now you have a new tool in your toolbox, and you've become smarter. So there's a real advantage to stepping away from the common, the average thing that you already know really, really well, and picking a new tool that seems better suited, not just to get your work done, but also to expand your capabilities and your tool set and what you can do. And so, of course, the conclusion here is that there really is no best. All there are trade-offs. And you really have to ask yourself a lot of different questions. What it is that you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it. Is iteration more important? Is reliability more important? Is being able to find a lot of developers and a lot of community to help you, is that more important? And you have to consider all these things and take them into account before you make your choice. That becomes, if you just use one of these criteria, what I know, or it's the best performing, or I have the least amount of code to work on, you're probably going to make the wrong choice and you'll end up regretting it later. And the truth is that you might end up changing as your project life cycle evolves. You might end up changing your language anyway. So it's not just at the beginning of the project, but it's also as things evolve. You have to decide, okay, now we know what we're building. Now we know what it looks like. We know there's a demand. And now we're going to switch to another language that is going to give us better performance or more reliability or has a larger community. And that's a fine way to look at it. You should be willing to correct your mistakes or not even necessarily consider them mistakes. They're just what you chose at that time to get you to the next level, and now you're at the next level. It's time to make another choice. And I've done that several times. So, all right, that is my talk. I wanted to get that up there. All right. It just goes away. All right. Well, anyway, you guys, I am like 13 followers away on Twitter from hitting 5,000. So if people want to follow me today, you'd really make my day. That would be awesome. So right there, at Damien Katz, I'm on Twitter. So follow me and make my day. That would be happy. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two questions. Anyone with a question? Okay. And just ask it, and I'll ask Damien to repeat the question.
So I think you said that really bad syntax is one of the problems with Erlang. And don't you think a better syntax on top of the same virtual machine would help?
Yeah. So I feel that it's the weird syntax. I don't necessarily say it's bad. There are some bad things about it. Every language has badness, but I think the big thing is that it's just weird, and it's so different from what other people use. And I have seen that, I think it's Elixir, maybe. I might have that wrong.
But they are fringe, libraries by no one. What I wanted to ask is, because you have such a
I'd love to do that. Unfortunately, I actually have to produce a database. I don't have the time for that. But yeah, that's always one of the things I want to do is create a new programming language. But that's not in the cards for me. But there is at least one project out there, and I think it's called Elixir, but I could be wrong, where they're really aiming to bring a kind of a Ruby-ish syntax to the Erlang VM.
They kind of break the Erlang along the way because they introduce stuff that doesn't map on top of Erlang. I'm not talking about new language, just take the Erlang, change the syntax to look like, better on the eyes so they don't start about an hour after you start looking at it.
Right.
And it would help, probably.
Yeah, I agree. A better language, a simpler syntax, or more familiar syntax would go a long way to making Erlang more popular. Yes.
What's your thought about Go? Did you play with it in the past?
What are my thoughts about Go? I think that Go has an extremely bright future. And that's one of the things that they've done right is they've taken a familiar syntax and taken out even the weirdness and simplified it. So it's very C-like in its syntax, and then they took some of the weirder parts of C and made it simpler and more consistent. And I think that is a big part of why we're seeing a lot of an explosion in that community and an upward trajectory. I don't think it's a replacement for C because it is garbage collected, and people who use C generally they want control over memory. But a lot of people in my work are very excited about Go, and I think it has a very bright future. And I think within 5 years it'll be as fast as Java and probably a nearly as big a community.
So, thanks to Damien.